Hello, this video is going to cover the start of modernism with Fauvism, Primitivism, and Expressionism. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. So Cézanne, you can see that this is a Cézanne. This is the large bathers from 1900 to 1906. And we talked about Cézanne in the last lecture, but Cézanne is critical for laying the groundwork for 20th century art. So he uses colors as a building block of form rather than an attribute of form. And I think that his apples really show this best. You can see how these are planes of color rather than the use of modeling to create rounded shapes. And so he's really abstracting from the form into just chunks, right? And so this is going to be critical for the art that we're going to see. And he likes to depict his objects from multiple viewpoints. So you can see here that this image is a bit askance. If you look at this arm of the chair, you're looking at it straight on, whereas this arm isn't even in the picture because it's going off at a diagonal. But despite all of this, his canvases still use relatively natural colors for the objects. And we're going to see that this is being taken to an extreme. And Cézanne also uses primitivism at a time of rapid industrialization and modernization. And so he creates naive art that suggests a natural state of simplicity while emphasizing the canvas as a two-dimensional support for juxtapositions of color, right? So that's what you see here. So the juxtaposition of the tan with the green and the blue, rather than a realistic depiction of something from nature. So it's this idea that art can be something greater than just representation. So using that information about Cézanne, we're going to walk into Fauvism. So this is the first major avant-garde movement, emerges around the turn of the 20th century. And the climax of the group activity is 1905 to 1906. By 1908, these artists begin to go their separate ways. And this movement is semi-abstracted. So the work that they're depicting is semi-abstract. We're not yet to the point of pure abstraction. So that is a canvas that completely lacks form, right? It's just color, harmony, etc. We're not quite there, but we're only about 5 years from that, 5 to 10 years. So this is fauve work, and fauve is French for wild beasts. And the fauve artists use color rather than being purely descriptive. They use it to convey expression and emotional affect. So the fauve artists are typically characterized by violent anti-natural use of strong color. These colors are often applied unmixed and straight from the tube. So this is a portrait from 1905. It's called Portrait of Madame Matisse, the Green Line. And this is by Henri Matisse, and it is a portrait of his wife. Okay, and you can see when you look in close just how abstracted this is. But this is abstracted in a different way than Impressionism. Okay, and so it is influenced by Impressionism, but it's also a reaction against Impressionism. So you can see how the way that some of these brushstrokes are combined is similar to Impressionism, but the use of color is really not. So this is very heightened, and these heightened colors are used to convey emotion. And so you can imagine that this is the face of a woman who in reality probably does not have a green line all the way down her forehead, nose, mouth, and chin. Okay, so this is something that the artist has juxtaposed or superimposed onto the face of his wife. And this is not an expression of distaste or anger towards his wife. This is merely using color to achieve something else, right? And so Matisse is the leading character in the Fauve movement. And he realizes the expressive power of color when he's painting in 1904 or 1905. And other characteristics of this, besides violent anti-natural colors that are often unmixed, applied straight from the tube, is a roughness of execution, a spontaneity or spontaneous nature, and bold sense of surface design. So do you see how this is not attempting to create a realistic 3D object? This is a flat canvas on which there is decorative application of paint, although there is still some attempt to create modeling in a semi-natural depiction of this woman, this portrait. So the Fauve artists are loosely associated. There's no coherent theoretical position like we're going to see soon, but they are all reacting against both academic and impressionist paintings, if you can believe it. They are influenced by Gauguin with his decorative and symbolic use, as well as broad areas of flat color. Van Gogh's element of expression and fracturing of the object that is being depicted, and the isolated marks of Neo-Impressionism. So I'm just going to show you a few more works by the Fauve artists. And this is another Matisse. This is Woman with the Hat. And again, you can see how the colors are heightened. This use of a very unnatural green color to depict the face. And so these artists are less interested in color theory than they are in the effect that color produces. And this is another work by Matisse that is Fauve, and this is Harmony in Red. This is a very famous work. And if you look at this, you can absolutely see the influence of Gauguin as well as Cézanne. Okay, so look at the perspective that's being depicted, all right? There's no clear edge to this table. It clearly bends a little bit, but the wallpaper in the background melds almost seamlessly with this tablecloth. And the perspective is odd, and the use of a black line to outline the various elements and the figure here is drawn from Gauguin. Okay, so the effect here, what Matisse is interested in is the effect of the color red. And this work was actually originally done in green, as you can see here at the bottom, just a little bit, and it didn't produce the desired effect. And so Matisse recreated it in red, covering the green over entirely. And for those of you who are like, well, maybe Matisse just didn't know how to paint, like maybe he didn't have the technical skills. He did. So all the artists that we're going to see have training in a classical way, or most of the artists, I should say. They're trained in classical art, and they're able to create natural, realistic depictions, but they choose not to. They're moving away from this traditional realistic imagery. Okay, again, so just some works. This is by Matisse. This is Le Bonheur de Vivre, or The Joy of Life. And again, you can see how flattened it is, how heightened the colors are, the outlines that are present in his work, okay? And this is La Danse, or Dance 2. Another Matisse from 1909 to 1910. And again, the emphasis here is on the emotion, right? These are not particularly natural poses that these figures are in as they dance, but rather the effect that this creates, right? The joy, the sheer joy of them dancing, doing the dance of life. You can see here it's depicted in the background of the still life, etc. Okay. So I'm going to move on. Matisse is not the only Fauve artist. This is André Derain, and he was particularly interested in flat expanses of color. Okay, again, right? Another Derain. But moving forward. All right, so I want to talk to you about the concept of primitivism. So to refer to art as primitive is extremely problematic, right? So it implies that it is less than where we are currently existing in time, right? And it implies that it's created by someone who is less civilized than we are. Okay, and so primitivism is inspired by the art of non-Western cultures primarily, as well as some ancient cultures. And so what you see here is a photograph of a 1933 exhibit in New York. And this is paintings by Duran juxtaposed with African sculptures, so that you can really see how the works by Duran are inspired by these sculptures, right? And these sculptures are from Central Africa, and they would be guardians for reliquary bundles. Okay, so a reliquary bundle is a container of human remains, right? And so there's ancestor veneration within these cultures, and so these are guardians of these reliquary bundles, or the remains of the ancestors. Okay, so they serve a highly spiritual function, and they are not designed merely to be decorative. They have a purpose. And this is the reliquary head, or nglobiere, of the Fang people. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And these are the sorts of artworks that artists are being exposed to that heavily inspire modernism in the early 20th century. And we're going to talk more about this when I discuss Cubism next week. But basically, the Western artists are interested in working in a naive or untrained style as an attempt to approach a more basic and direct means of expression. Basically, they're looking to non-Western art forms to help them escape the constraints of Western tradition. So the African objects that we're looking at are actually highly sophisticated in their abstraction of the human figure. And this is something that is not acknowledged by the modern artists. And you can see the Nglobiere that we just saw is depicted here. And this is Jacob Epstein's studio in 1959 photograph. So you can see how he has these objects all around him, and he's very much inspired by them. And so Picasso sees African sculptures as helping him to understand his purpose as a painter, which is not to entertain with decorative images, but to mediate between reality, perceived reality, and the creativity of human mind. So basically, artists are starting to feel like, where do we go from here? I'm tired of these various forms of expression, even heightening the colors, right? So like the green stripe, it's no longer enough. They want to push it farther and farther. They want to push the bounds of art. And so the increasing exposure to non-Western art objects is really what inspires the avant-garde in the early 20th century. This is actually a contemporary photo of the Barnes collection. And this is an example of how it was arranged by the original collector Barnes in the early to mid 20th century. So you can see that he's juxtaposing Gothic and Renaissance objects with African objects with, say, Modigliani and Picasso, right? So these are 20th century avant-garde artists. Okay, and it's not just African objects. You also see objects from oceanic cultures as well as Native American, right? So moving on, I'm going to talk to you about Expressionism, and you should be able to see how there really is this effect of primitivism in the art of the Expressionists. So the term primitive art is very problematic, as I mentioned before. So it is still used in art historical literature because that is how it was referred to at the time. But nowadays, there's a much more nuanced discussion of the art as opposed to simply calling it primitive. One last thing that I wanted to point out, and my apologies, So these figures would have been attached to the reliquary bundles, like I mentioned, but there is zero interest in the West in the reliquary bundles at the time, because all that is interesting to collectors is the form of these objects. And so these objects are completely decontextualized and presented for visual pleasure in the West. Okay, so Expressionism. This is a movement, and it's the word expression, but the E is capitalized, okay? And that indicates that it's part of this movement. It's similar to Romantic and Romanticism, right? The capital R indicates something different than the lowercase r. So this is a German movement, and it is semi-abstracted. It's the use of color and form to express internal and extra-pictorial qualities. So things like spirituality, emotion, psychology, right? It's an antidote to Impressionism. So it seeks to recreate, Impressionism seeks to recreate outward sensations, and Expressionism is turning inwards. And so they are rejecting naturalism as inadequate in order to express the growing anxiety and dislocation and utopian fantasies of interwar German society. And it's roughly 1905 to 1920. And it's not just in painting, it's in sculpture, it's in music, it's in literature, it's in dance, etc. And it lacks a very precise definition, although there are some very specific groups that we're going to get into. So one thing that I want to highlight for you is that there is this growing sense of unease, particularly in Germany in the early 20th century. So we have World War I coming up, and that is a situation where the assassination of one man leads to an international conflict that leads to the death of millions of people, okay? So a war like that doesn't just happen out of nowhere, right? You have to have the right situation in order to produce the conditions that would lead to this type of war. World War I was actually called the Great War, or the war to end all wars. It was seen as a type of war that was horrific and all-encompassing and would never happen again. And then World War II happened about 20 years later. So I'm going to talk to you more about World War I because it's really important in terms of the art. But a couple of other things that I want to talk to you about in terms of Expressionism, and then I will move into a couple of specific Expressionist groups. So the name Expressionism is actually not from critics. It's used to indicate perceived stylistic opposition to Impressionism, right? So rather than being an impression, it's an expression, okay? And it is often linked to medieval Gothic work. There's this anti-materialism and a manifestation of new spirituality. So there are anxieties, but also hopes that modern humanity can give birth to a constructive form. So it is a complete rejection of naturalistic work. Okay, so you can see how we have, similar to the Fauves, right? We have this heightened color. We have these very flattened bodies. So this is called Street Dresden, and it's by Ernst Kirchner from 1908. So this work is intended to produce anxiety. And so it's basically the concept of never so alone as in a crowd, right? So you have modernity, right? Modern times. You have technological advances. So you have like a streetcar or something similar here. And you have this crowd of people, but it's rather hostile. And the colors are such as like, this is the psychic version of nails on a chalkboard. That's what Kirchner is going for. Okay. And so there is this expression of angst. So angst in German means anxiety. And that is really a driving motivation with these works. Right. So again, right, these very angular, cutting, aggressive forms here by Kirchner. And you can see how it's almost violent the way that they slash across the canvas. right? This is Emil Nolde. And Nold is very interested in masks and non-Western forms. Okay, but again, there is this use of bold decorative color as seen with Gauguin, the expressiveness of Van Gogh, and then the expression of angst as seen in Munch's work. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about Die Brücke, and this means the bridge in German, and it's formed in Germany in 1905. And Kirchner and Nold and a few other artists are part of it. And so the artists that we're looking at now are members of this group. And in 1906, they publish a manifesto, and the impulses behind their work are the strength of youth, the value of directness and authenticity, faith in the future, and rejection of older forces. It is disbanded by 1913, but the word the bridge, or Die Brücke, it symbolizes the link holding members together, right? So they thought that they were acting as a bridge to the future. They were actually very idealistic. They believed that art could change the world from its very core functions, right? They wanted to encompass all of life, not just art with this stance. And so it involved interior decoration, etc. And there's a lot of collaboration. So influences include things like Gothic woodcuts, German craft traditions. So there's this look back to the more expressive artistic forms of the Gothic period, as well as this desire to get in touch with this spirituality that is seen as inhabiting Gothic art. Okay, so this is The Last Supper by Nold from 1909. And so this is a depiction of Jesus Christ surrounded by his apostles. But again, everyone has this rather contorted, disfigured face, these heightened colors. It's very unsettling. Okay, so let's see here. We have all of these figural distortions. We have very direct rendering, right? This flatness, this expressive use of color linked to the fauves. We have angular areas of flat, violently clashing colors. Okay, we often see outlines. And all of these things are characteristic of Expressionism in general, but also Die Brücke, or the bridge. And so this is the Life of Christ by the same artist from 1911 to 12. And you can tell that it's based on a polyptych or an altarpiece, right? And you can see how similar some of the forms are to the Gothic and early Renaissance works. Okay. So just some more images. This is the artist Kathy Kollwitz, and she is not necessarily, I'm not including it here necessarily as an example of Die Brücke, but merely as an example of Expressionism. So Kollwitz is a female artist, and she taps into very primal emotions. So here you see Woman with Dead Child, and this is a print. It's from 1903. And so what you see is this female clutching the body of her deceased child. And Kollwitz actually used her own son as the boy in this composition. And you can tell that the boy has these features that are very naturalistic, right? You can recognize him as a boy. But the woman, the mother, she is contorted. She's disfigured by her grief. Her emotions are overwhelming her, and she's turning into this primal animalistic figure who clutches her dead child in sorrow. And sadly, this is prefiguring Kollwitz's own destiny. Her son died in World War I. Okay, so again, right, influence of woodcuts from the early Renaissance, from Dürer. Okay, and Kollwitz is very preoccupied with death and loss and the emotions that come with this, and these very oversized hands So this is titled Killed in Action, right? And so this is a depiction of a woman whose husband has just died, and she's surrounded by her numerous children, all begging for help, right? The sense of hopelessness, of despair, of raw emotions is hopefully coming through to you. She also depicted peasants. So this is called charge or outbreak. And here you see a woman urging peasants on to rise up against the people who oppressed them in 1902 to 1903. And again, right, you can see that these figures, they are very animalistic. They're less than human. And this is not a negative commentary on the lower classes who are rising up. It's commentary on how they have been treated and the anger that they're feeling, right? Look at her hands, these claws, right? The marks here for her hands and her arms, right? So just very primal emotions are central to her work. Okay, and so sometimes we see the attenuation or the stretching of figures, as with Lembrook's work. So basically, these are distortions of form in order to create an emotional sense. Okay, so next I want to talk to you about Der Blue Reiter, which is the Blue Rider in German. So this is a group, it's German Expressionism, and it's formed in 1911. And in 1909, Kandinsky, who is a major artist, he forms a committee for an exhibit and a separate exhibit, right? So not like a salon style hanging. But that very committee actually rejects his own work in 1911. And so he organizes an opposing exhibit. And this is where Der Blue Reiter comes from. Okay. And so Kandinsky and another artist who's very prominent in this group is Franz Marc, whose work we're seeing here. And so these artists are focused on the idea of abstraction. And Der Blue Reiter is broken up by the outbreak of war in 1914. So Mark, this artist, and another artist from the group actually die in action, and Kandinsky, who is Russian, returns to Russia for the duration of the war because Germany and Russia are on opposing sides, and Der Blue Reiter is German. So a quote from Der Blue Reiter is, "None of us seeks to reproduce nature directly. We are seeking to give artistic form to inner nature or spiritual experience." So they want to express the inner desires of different artists in a variety of forms. And Der Blue Reiter is not particularly cohesive. It doesn't have particular stylistic elements that are the same, but there is this overarching concern for the spiritual within art, as well as emphasizing qualities of primitive art. So not only is there this fascination with non-Western art at the time, but there's also an interest in work by people who have not been trained. So the art of children is seen as very pure because they haven't been trained and civilized, right? As well as the art of the mentally ill. And this is another example of a very problematic term that is used in art still, although with greater nuance now. And this is art of the insane. Okay, so let me just briefly talk about Mark. So the founding of this group is supposedly, Kandinsky claimed that we both liked the color blue, Mark liked the word horse, and I liked rider, and so we put it together. But there's likely a lot more to it. But basically, an overarching idea here is that the essence of things can be revealed to mankind through art. And Mark is particularly obsessed with animals. He sees them as less distorted by culture than man. They're more innocent. And he really, really loves animals. And he depicts them directly in nature. He's trying to create a sense of unity between mankind and animals, right? All of this. And so he sees a widespread need for spiritual renewal in what is seen as a very materialistic age, so preoccupied with possessions. And he's open to different forms of communication. And the majority of his works are, in fact, of horses. But he does also depict other types of animals, and his works become progressively more abstract, and they move from this very serene, lyrical, rhythmic expression, right? If you look here, you can see the forms of the horses' necks, right? Mirror that of the landscape and the rumps of the horses. It's very lyrical. But as we move closer to the start of World War I, his work becomes progressively more anxious, and even the animals are unable to escape the tension that precedes World War I. Okay, so you can see how the very soft, rounded forms, they're starting to be more angular elements, right? These slashing lines, but there is still this rounded, but again, you can sense the difference, I hope. And if we keep moving, he moves into work like the stables here, which is increasingly abstracted. So remember, we don't yet have pure abstraction, but these artists are moving towards it until finally we have the fate of the animals. And this is one of the last works by Mark. He dies the next year. It's from 1913, so just before the war starts. And you can see how violent this canvas is. We have deer and horses, and they're no longer rhythmic and in tune with nature and one with the landscape. They're fighting, they're angular, there are these slashing marks. It's incredibly aggressive and violent. And you can see that the colors are no longer harmonious. We have these foxes here. And basically, this is a view of the destruction, the burning of forests, and the agony the animals endure. And this is a very apt depiction of Europe just prior to the outbreak of World War I. So it's really very sad. And then he dies in the war. So the other major artist in this group is Kandinsky. And let me move towards Kandinsky. So Kandinsky is also very lyrical, but he's much less focused on animals and depicting that. He's very interested in Russian folk art. There's this painting on glass that's very popular in terms of folk art. There is icons, right? All of these things. And so Kandinsky is looking at these and incorporating these effects into his own work. But there is this focus on the spiritual. Okay, so again, it's a very lyrical style. And Kandinsky argues that abstraction offers a universality that representation cannot. And color acts separately from form, and it carries spiritual values that he feels are lost in the experience of modernity, right? So this emphasis on technology and advancement, all of this. So he's kind of looking more towards nature, and he sees music as a metaphor for abstract art. So it has form and tone. It can be felt, it can be heard, but the forms themselves are not seen. And so he attempts to create music like you would hear, but on a canvas. Okay, so not just something musical and beautiful, but actually depicting music on canvas. And Kandinsky is one of the first to engage in, sorry, that was a Franz mark, pure abstraction. Okay, so he is slowly moving towards pure abstraction. And often his works are named after music, right? So here you can see this is 1913, but you can see, right, like these castles. So there's very clearly this throwback to Gothic times, to Russian folk art, historical times, okay? And then he has works titled Improvisations. And so we're moving here towards abstract work. And this one is a little bit later, 1921. It's called Blue Segment number 235. But again, just these completely abstract works. Composition 8 from 1923. Okay. And you can kind of, I hope, see how this is an attempt at depicting the sound of music visually. Okay. So that wraps it up for this lecture, and I hope you found that illuminating. Bye.